With remote duels and some locals opening up in some areas, people are looking for decks to pick up and they just don't want to spend all that money. A lot of these cards are expensive in the format, but you're just looking to play on a budget. Here I'm going to be showing you guys some cheap decks you can play on a budget that are really powerful. And for these decks to be so cheap, there's a lot of good cards in these decks. So I'm going to be bringing you some cheap decks that you can play on a budget. It's going to be, something around $100 or less. Some of these decks range from, $70, $60, maybe even $50 to like 100, maybe a little bit over 100. But I want to give you guys the cheapest and most competitive decks you can play in these events. Or if you just want to play these decks with your friends, I want to give you the best options you have. So the first deck I want to talk about in this video is a very obvious choice, and that is the Rocket strategy. Rockets have been really good in the past year. In 2020, early 2020, when we still had events, we had Shun Ping win with Rockets, and it was really crazy because the deck isn't running Needle Fiber, the deck isn't running all of these crazy combo cards that we are running now in the current build of Rockets, and it's still really strong. You put up boards with something like the Unchained Abomination, you have like Savage, you still have the Erotic Seal, so the deck is still very strong. And if you still have a little bit more money to kind of build these type of decks, you could throw in something like Union Carrier, insert Buster Whelp, but even then, you still have a really strong deck. It's just really strong at, building a board. You still have something like Silver Rocket Dragon being able to rip a card out of your opponent's extra deck. You still have Savage for negates. You still have all these rockets that do different effects and recover your resources. So this deck is still really strong. It's still really good on a budget, and you don't need stuff like Needle Fiber, Halka Firebex, Link Cross, Auroradon, like all this other stuff. You just need the rockets, and they're all reprinted in the Megatons or they are in a structure deck. So I think this is like the best option you have as a budget player. So the next deck I want to talk about in this video is a little old friend of ours from 2018, and that is the Goat Key strategy. Goat Keys are still very strong. You still have something like a Soul that is really good for tuning out your warriors. You still have the Goat Keys that float into these other Goat Keys, like your Goat Key Rematch, and the other Goat Keys like Headbat that is really good for an extender. And then you have stuff like the Code Breakers that are a new addition to the deck. They're able to get used to something like Rusty Bardies, and they're still good for link material. And then you have something like the Evil Storm Nightmare. You don't really need stuff like Verte Anaconda into Dragoon, or you don't need IP Masquerena, but it is very strong to go IP Masquerena into Unicorn. But you still have a lot of different tools to your deck. You still have all these interruptions, like the Phantom Knight Fogblade. You still have the Rank 4 tool, and you still have stuff like Apollosa, which is probably the only expensive card in your deck, if not a couple of other cards that are expensive. But the Gokis are very cheap. Like they're just commons in, Star Pack, or they're reprinted in the Megatons. So these cards are very cheap and they're very powerful. So this is definitely a really good option if you're looking for a combo strategy. Now, this next deck is a very weird deck. I'm gonna tell you, when I looked up this deck, I was like, what does this deck do? I'm like, what? And this deck is Zephyr. Zephyr is pretty good as a pure strategy, and all of the cards are super dirt cheap. You don't even really need to expend that much money. And if you really wanted to boost up your budget, you can play, more hand traps like Nibiru that is expensive because you have all of these cheap options. And you have stuff like the Zephyr War and all of these Zephyr and Yingzing traps that are really good for interrupting your opponent. And then you have the Zephyr Path that is really good at being that floodgate. Oh, it's not gonna stop your opponent from, playing entirely, but it puts you on the same level that you are on, and then you can pretty much interrupt with your traps, which puts you at a advantage. And then you have stuff like the Gallet Granite that is really good with the Dolce engine, which is just a rank 4 engine to get you into your Zephyr so you can get your engine going. And then you have the Orkov Zephyr that is still a really powerful card with not only being a searcher, it has an ability to stack your deck if you summon a synchro like the Crocosaur. So it's just really, really good as a control strategy. And it's a very unique deck because I don't think anybody knows that this deck is really good and really cheap and is a really solid control strategy. The next deck I want to talk about in this video is a deck that has been rising in popularity and is very cheap because of the Megatons, and that is the Unchained Strategy. The Unchained monsters being able to pop their own cards to float into other monsters, and then using your opponent's monsters as link material. This deck is really strong at going second. You still have the hand traps that are really good. You have stuff like Gamma, you have Ogre, you have Veiler. These cards are just very cheap. And you have something like no material. It's still like a really solid card that people are citing in some LCS events, and you have some remote duel events that have these hand traps like Gnome material or Lancia that are really strong. And the deck really played Extravagance, but you can move to something like Desires as a more budget option. But if you do have the option of having a Extravagance or so, you should play that. But Desires is a really solid replacement because the only cards you really care about banishing is the dog, and that's really it. You run three of every single Unchained card in your main deck, and you don't really need an extra deck for your strategy. So if you are running Extravagance, you can play stuff like that. But if you're on a budget option, as this video says, you run something like Desires, and then you have some other going second cards like Prankertops. You have stuff like the Kaijus that are really good. You have Mind Control, all of these going second cards that are very cheap and budget options. So this deck is really solid at going second, breaking through boards, and kind of controlling the field as a control archetype. This next archetype is another blast from the past and was recently meta before we had all of this Aurora Dawn, Halka Link Cross era, and that is the Shaddoll archetype. Shadolls are still really good at putting out Winda over and over again, and with the Shaddoll Schism, it's become easier and easier to kind of spam out these Windas and kind of keep your engine rolling and being able to OTK with all of these fusions. With Invoker being expensive, you do have to replace it with something like Vision Hero Vion, which searches Poly and is also a dark to make something like Winda, and is really good for having that body on board to make something like Cross Sheep, being able to combo into, different things and make a rank 4 or make a, link 4, which is really, really nice. Something like Unchained Abomination is just a really powerful link 4, and it'll probably be in a lot of these different cheap decks because it's just a very strong boss monster. But still, this deck is good for what it was good, 5 years ago. Just summoning Winda, shutting down your opponent, and then floating into all of these different monsters. And you still have something like the Perform Mage engine that is really good for being a light, so you can make El Shaddai Construct. And you have these different hand traps like Gamma and Ogre that are really good because they are not only hand traps, but they are light monsters. Now, this next archetype you wouldn't really think is a budget deck, or you can play on a budget, but after looking at the deck and how people are playing it, you can pretty much play this deck on a budget, at least for at least $100 or less, and that is the Frightfur or Fluffle strategy. You have something like Frightfur, Cruel Whale, and the Dolphin that are pretty cheap because they were commons in the Rise of the Duelist set. And you still have something like Fright for Kraken that is really good, but is expensive. But with something like Sabretooth, you can summon back that Kraken, so you don't really need 2 or 3 copies of this card. All you need is this one copy of Kraken, which is probably about, $12 to $13. And then the rest of the deck is pretty cheap, besides, Bear might be a few dollars. You have something like the Penguin that might be a few dollars. But the rest of the deck is pretty cheap because all of the cards are commons or at most super rares because all of the reprints. And then you still have, because of this Cruel Whale being level 9, you can make True Kings of all calamities, which is really powerful. And you don't have the option of Bahamut Shark and a Toad, but you still have something like Dweller, which is really strong. But if you don't want to, go first, make these turn one boards, you can go second in OTK with a bunch of hand traps like Gamma and Ogre and Veiler, all of these cheap hand traps, or with going second cards like Kaiju's, Dark Ruling, or more to break your opponent's board. Now, this last archetype I want to talk about in this video is the obligatory trap deck that I feel like is always going to be talked about in these type of videos, and that is the Altergeist strategy. Altergeist is really good at controlling the board with all these trap cards, and then you have the Altergeist monsters that are really good for controlling the board with something like Silquitas, being able to bounce cards, Conquery, being able to protect your monsters from being attacked, and then you have something like Hexia, which is a really strong boss monster and can negate spell and trap cards or their effects. And then you have something like the Numeron engine that can be really good as a substitute for Extravagance because that card is very expensive. Or you can have something like Pot of Duality, which is really good for getting to your Altergeist cards. This deck is just very solid and has been a solid deck for quite a while. And it's still very good as a control deck. You don't have the, Verte Anaconda, combo with this deck, or you don't have these other kind of expensive trap cards like Ice Draken Prison. But this deck is still very solid as a trap deck and is still very strong at kind of controlling the board, OTKing with Hexia, or, having this ability to have this Numeron strategy, locking your opponent down and, controlling the board is pretty much the main goal of this deck and is just a really good solid strategy to run as a control player. So that is it, guys. I had an amazing time building these decks on my live stream, twitch.tv/Celza. I built all of these decks on the live stream. If you want to see or, look at my opinions on these decks, be sure to check out those live streams and make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to my channel for more amazing videos like this. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. I am out. Peace.